speakers. My name is Carlos Mendez, and I'm a co-director at the EPRC here at the University of Strathclyde. And we're delighted to welcome Alina Dragos to today's webinar, which is, I think, the third in our annual series. The topic today is local political leadership and administrative capacity for EU structural funds. The presentation will last around 30 minutes, followed by a discussion and a question and answer session from the audience. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar. This is to allow you and colleagues to revisit the session on our YouTube channel at a later date. Please feel free to use social media. You can share your thoughts on the webinar during the webinar or after. And let me begin now by presenting our speaker. Dr. Alina Dragos obtained her PhD here at the University of Strathclyde last year in 2023. Her thesis explored the role of local political leadership and administrative capacity in EU cohesion policy implementation across a range of different cities in Romania. Currently, Alina works for the EU Cohesion Policy Managing Authority of the Regional Programme for the European Regional Development Fund and the European Social Fund Plus for the current 21-27 period in the region Île-de-France. Her research interests include government capacity and capacity building, political leadership, civic engagement and multi-level governance, the design and implementation of public policy and cohesion policy, so urban and regional development and post-socialist cities. I'll give the floor to Alina now. I hope you've managed to email us your slides and you can begin on the basis of your presentation, Alina.
Thank you, Carlos, for the presentation, for the introduction. And thank you everyone for attending the seminar. I was not able to send you the presentation because it's too large, so I will need to share my screen.
Okay.
Okay, just a second. Entire screen. I'm not sure are you able to see?
Yes, we can see generally. Yeah, and this is your title screen.
Yes. So as you mentioned, I will be presenting today my doctoral research. That is where I focused on local political leadership and administrative capacity in the context of cohesion policy. And I focused, I conducted my research in the case of focusing on several Romanian cities. This is the outline of the research. So I will be presenting the conceptual framework that I used for my study, a few words about the research process, and then the key findings and the contributions. Romania is one of the countries in the EU that concentrates the least developed regions within the EU, defined as having a GDP per capita below 75 of the EU average, with the exception of the Bucharest region, the capital region. You might all know cohesion policy is targeting exactly these types of territories in order to bring a balanced development of its entire territory. So Romania is an important case for cohesion policy. When we look back at the track record of the entire country, when it comes to the absorption of EU funds, for instance, if we look at 2007-2013, we can see that Romania is about among the member states that has the lowest absorption level, spending level of cohesion policy funds in comparison with the EU average. And it also took a lot of time to Romania to get to this level. So it's not only about the level of how many funds it managed to attract, but also in how much time it managed to do so. However, despite this national low spending level that was consistent over time, we can, within the country, if we look at the country at the level of its regions, which are only statistical regions. It's the specific case of Romania. There are no political regions, there are no regional governments in Romania to handle these funds. So when we look at how the spending at the level of each region has happened, we can see there is a lot of variation, and there are some regions, for instance, Northwest region, that managed to keep their level of spending up. And also we can see variations in Romania, notable variations at the level of municipalities, level of cities. So therefore, within a centralized unitary system, political system, as we find in Romania, some cities and regions were registered variations and good spending levels, but also some cities managed to show that they spent a lot of EU funds, and in a very innovative way and integrated manner, and managed to do incredible things. So this sparked actually the interest for this research. What has happened in these cities that managed to attract funds, and despite the national story that we have, that despite 2 consecutive programming periods, Romania struggled to spend the allocated funds within the time allocated. Another contextual aspect about cohesion policy is that in the 2014-2020 period, there is an increased focus on urban development, and in fact the new regulation emphasized this aspect and imposed a sort of a financial constraint, as it encouraged countries to allocate at least 5% of the country's ERDF to the urban development. So this policy emphasis on urban development, correlated with what has happened in Romania, created this research interest, sparked this research interest, and the research questions. When I try to look at the research question, which interrogated about what has happened in these cities that managed to do incredible things with EU funds, despite a low national level. When I tried to answer this research, I looked at the previous research, and then I found that previous studies have looked at the regional levels mostly, and looked at the governance system of the EU funds, management system, and trying to answer this question about the regional variation about national variations among countries. 2 key factors were found, focusing either on administrative aspects or political factors. However, the local level was under-researched, and specifically within the political factors, the role of politicians was not explored in detail, and specifically how exactly politicians affect these regional or national variations. And also in terms of administrative capacity, we find a lot of studies looking at either national government capacity or governance. But little research really looks at what happens at the level of, at the city level, at the level of the beneficiary, as we call those benefiting from EU funds. And this is how this was my starting point, trying to propose this explanation for this research question, and proposing local political leadership to explain unexpected local achievements in attracting EU funds. Within this, we could call a national environment which was not conducive to attracting funds. So to go about the further research question, what explains this local variation, and whether or not local political leadership and administrative capacity can explain differences, I looked at different theories. I looked at research on EU public policies, as I mentioned before, specifically cohesion policy implementation. I looked at public administration literature to explore this administrative capacity factor, and also this literature also indicated that the discussion of administrative capacity is very, very complex, and it also relates to the way public administrations interact with the political aspect of public administrations, and also looked at leadership theories in order to propose an explanation in order to develop this concept of local political leadership, and found as I was looking at local administrations, at political entities, so political leadership was a very relevant concept to develop. But so this is how I build. These are the theories. This is the literature I looked at to create a theoretical explanation. But in order to answer this research question, I had to look before to look into the question, a broader question. What has happened at the national level with all municipalities, local administrations, and what exactly were facing all local authorities when trying to access funds. So I tried to identify, to explore. It was an explorative research here to identify the factors that actually influence all local authorities when they try to access EU funds, and to identify some specific systemic issues, systemic problems that were affecting everyone. And in this way, I could narrow down my explanation to just these two factors when trying to answer my second research question. So in order to do this research and answer these questions, I selected some cities as case studies. So I looked at 8 cities, county capitals. As I said before, Romania doesn't have, has only, in terms of subnational actors, it doesn't have regions, political regions, but only county and city level. So I selected 8 big cities that are comparable, as similar as possible, from 2 statistical regions that are very, very similar. And so what I try to do is to look at what has happened in terms of implementation record and within these 8, and then to compare them and see what is the experience of these 8 cities with attracting EU funds, and how are my 2 factors behaving. Also, I had to conduct similar case comparisons. So I had to group cities based on similarity. For instance, I did city-to-city comparison as well to enhance the similarity factor. So for instance, I compared Timișoara with Cluj-Napoca because they have similar size, they have similar regional roads. Let's say they are the biggest cities and most important in their geographic area, and then I compared, for instance, Arad with Oradea, and then Deva with Zalău, and Reșița with Bistrița. So I enhanced the similarity factor. I also looked at 5 small cases, although my main focus was 8 county capitals, because they would fall under this EU regulation of urban sustainable development. So they were really targeted by this cohesion policy initiative of enhanced focus on urban development. But I took 5 small towns just to see how these 2 factors behave in a small environment, especially the administrative capacity. It really depends. One of the assumptions is that it depends on size, on the size of the local administration. So for this, I conducted interviews. I went there, I visited all 13 municipalities, and I focused on the EU unit on each municipality. So I didn't. So this is how I selected my unit of analysis. This is how I selected my interviewees, based on exactly who is working on attracting EU funds, and also, of course, interviewing local political leaders, mayors or deputy mayors. And I did that in the big cities and the small ones. Of course, this is the field work, but I looked at documents, at other policy documents. I looked at local strategies. So it was a desk research also that complemented the interviews, and also implementation data. The theoretical framework for the local political leadership, as is defined in the thesis, it takes an interactionist approach. So this interactionist approach of the political leaders says that actually each leader, when they lead, when they are in position of leading, they interact with their leadership environment. So their actions are not cut from what is happening around them. And this approach actually combines agency, so the quality of and the actions and the decisions of an individual, with the structures around you, with the environment that is around this leader, because they cannot be cut off. So even if someone has good qualities, if the context around is very constraining and very adversarial, maybe these qualities cannot do a lot. So that's why this interaction approach, it's really rich, because it combines agency and structure. So the two are in a continuous relationship. The leader interacts with what is happening around, with the institutional structures, which are laws and regulations, but also institutions as organizations. In our case, all the structures around the EU funds, but also societal needs. So what is happening at the society level, in the context level, and this interaction is actually political leadership as understood in this study. The politicians, they act within a leadership environment, but they act on certain leadership tasks or functions. And so related to this specific investigation and public policy in general, 3 stages were identified where leaders actually intervene. In the formulation phase is where actually the problems and the needs are identified, and then solutions are conceived, and then political goals, policy goals, and are established. The mobilization phase is the phase in which actually the action is planned. How to act on these political decisions taken in formulation stage, and in mobilization stage, we might find, for instance, actions such as preparing the resources, the human resources, the administrative resources to act on the strategies, on the investments decided in the formulation phase. And this we might call capacity building phase, or it can have many names, but actually it is a mobilization of resources towards action. Implementation phase is the operational phase, in which actually what has been decided takes an operational form. Leaders and the administration actually work together to accomplish the goals. So combining the interactionist approach to political leadership, and the leadership demands. The concept of local political leadership was conceived as an interaction between political leaders, elected political leaders, and the leadership environment exercised through these leadership functions. So it's a process that goes through these phases. This is like the model at the end. So this combination of interactionist approach with the stages in which we find leaders act, and all this leads to a sort of outcome. The conceptual framework, however, includes also administrative capacity. So I have all these two explanations. Then administrative capacity as political leadership is also investigated through these stages. In order to be able to analyze the data, in order to unpack the concept, I created these analytical dimensions for local political leadership and administrative capacity. I don't think I will have time to go into depth, but I created this slide and more slides just because I know that this will be shared, and if someone wants to dig deeper, we have information. But mainly, local political leadership follows the phases identified, the local political leadership dimensions, but also they follow the interactionist approach I just mentioned. So, for instance, the first three dimensions, public accountability, context, interaction, and multi-level interactions, they actually refer to the interaction of the local leader with the society, public accountability, with the structures, which is multi-level governance, which is a structure of specific also to EU funds, but not only, to cohesion policy funds, and the interaction with the context, the local context. And vision, it speaks mostly to the personal characteristics of leader. There are some local leaders that are more visionary, that conceive their governing way by looking at a very farther away into the future and try to align what they do with these objectives. And then the last three, so the first three interactions, we might call them external interactions. So local leader interacting with the environment external to their office and to their administration that they lead. But the last three is interaction with the environment, which is an internal environment, leadership environment, we can call it, which is the interaction of the local leader in the mobilization stage, when they try to conceive a strategic plan to how to go about their investments, their goals, and then what do they do in terms of organizing resources? Do they create a specific structure for each type of goal they pursue? And then internal relations, how they local leaders interact with the administration in execution. Administrative capacity, I looked at the dedicated structures, so whether or not there were specific EU fund structures and how the roles are allocated, what is the hiring capacity of the institution and retention, and then also look at the human resources and collaboration of the EU dedicated structure internally, but also externally. So yeah, this is the analytical framework that I used to answer the second research question. For the first research question, what I tried to do, I mean, this is a very sketchy finding, but what I did was a multi-level governance analysis that I called, to identify the institutional and the structural features of the system that was governing the implementation process, and to identify different factors that could be situated at different levels. Some factors were at the EU level, some factors belong to the national level, some regional, some local. And I group them in 4 categories. So one factor is the territorial and administrative arrangements. So Romania is a unitary state, so everything is conceived at the national level in Bucharest. So it's more of a top-down approach. Also, these arrangements affected the way local administrations function. They were delegated more and more roles, but we have a little financial delegation of resources, and this was an important factor because EU funds demand co-funding, and governance refers to entire system of governing the EU funds, and this was also affecting, as the appetite of local leaders to engage or not with the EU funds specifically. Local actors are in either it's not it is advisable to have local leaders, local authorities involved in the when conceiving, for instance, the program, the EU funding program, in consultations, but it's not mandatory. So we see patchy or irregular interactions, and either in the programming stage when the program is conceived or later on. The regulatory framework was also an important factor, the institutions, because EU regulation advised member states to focus on certain thematic areas, and the question was whether local leaders perceive these priorities as meaningful to their own priorities. And then, of course, the local conditions played a role at the national level, because the national level faces, at the local level, we face a lot of demographic changes, a lot of drain, but are also not only at the, we can see that on the labor market, but also at the level of private actors willing to engage with EU funds. When it comes to the key findings, I don't have time to go through everything, but public accountability, for instance, I found what was extremely important to EU funds, and public accountability as understood in this study, like civic engagement. I looked at civic engagement in when conceiving different local strategies in the planning stage. I looked at participatory budgeting, and I looked at also the different engagement tools used by local leaders to engage with the society, whether or not we had frequent meetings with the citizens, if they were repetitive, if they were consistent over time. So this was important, and what I found out was confirmed some previous research that there where local leaders prioritize EU funds and there where they engage with society, they are more committed to the goal of attracting EU funds. So somehow this accountability it can act as a pressure to local leaders to act. Context interaction was problematic to everyone, but there are local authorities that manage to be very creative when looking at what the EU offers in terms of resources, and to create this match between what the macro policy at EU level was going towards and what the very specific needs. And some needs were very basic. There are still towns in Romania that don't have basic infrastructure, whereas the EU looks at reducing the carbon imprint. There are cities that don't have public lighting, or they don't have even public services like running water or warm water, or they don't have the roads that not cover the entire city. So this is where creative mayors were really managed to create this match. Multi-level interaction actually was a very important one, because this on the vertical line, I found there were cases that were very active in engaging with all the actors above, and they had a lot of appetite before the formal action programming started, just to find out where is the cohesion policy going towards. They engaged with the national government to find out about when the program will be released. So there are cities that managed to go on the vertical side and grasp as much information as possible before they even conceive their own strategy of how they want to go about with attracting the funds. And that we find even horizontal interactions, like authorities among them, local authorities, they group, they share the information, they share the experience, because they wanted to speak as a common voice. Specifically, my 8 cases, they created a Western Alliance. Like, it's a non-political, but they organized just to put pressure on the local government, on the national government, to listen to them, because they were not part of the governance system, but they are meaningful political actors. Vision was, again, a very important finding. Specifically in those cases, I found cases where an overarching long-term plan was integrated into the regional strategies, and so to give coherence to all the investments, regardless of the funding resource. So vision actually is something that goes beyond a specific investment opportunity, and it's something that just looks at where do we want to go with the city in terms of development. Strategic approach when building the we're building a roadmap, or how do we want to, what types of funds we want to attract, and how do we want to integrate. There were several cases that displayed these. They were really strategic. They were not reacting to funds. They were ahead prepared. This is what we want to do, and this is what we go about, and the funds are there just to allow us to go where we want to go. And this strategic approach, of course, was not found everywhere, but there were cities that tried to overcome the systemic, let's say, barriers that I mentioned earlier through a very thorough analysis of what they want to do. Building the structure in relation to what they wanted to do was an important factor. I found there were cities that they created very strong funding unit with different tasks and very well divided, following the entire policy process. Other ones that relied mostly on external help and consultancy. Internal leadership relations, so how leaders interacted with the administration. This is I found variation among cities. There were some that needed a lot of intervention from the leader, and mostly this happened where administrative resources were lacking. So the more capacity they had, the less need they had, let's say, for a leader integration. So having a lot of internal relations doesn't mean necessarily that this is what they need, because they might not need the help of if they have a strong EU unit. In terms of a capacity, administrative capacity, so it is related not to what mayors did, but actually what eventually had. And some of most of the big cities, they had, if not all, they had an EU dedicated structure. We find just variation in terms of how complex these structures were. I also looked at the human resource capacity, what the capacity of the institutions to attract people for the roles and the tasks that identify that are meaningful for attracting funds. And we find a relationship between the hiring efforts. So what has happened in the previous stage, for instance, here in the capacity structure building, and what has happened here, for instance, had an impact here, whether there are not efforts to attract people that could help implement the plans they made. Sorry, here, the hiring efforts, we find an interesting case in Zalău. There were a lot of efforts made, but because of a lack of human resource on the labor market, there was a low hiring capacity, but because institutionally they were they managed to keep the resources out, so they had a high capacity to retain people. Actually, despite low hiring capacity, they had enough people to go about their investments. So the conclusion is that they had enough human resources for what they wanted to do. So this is a graph what I did, but keep in mind it was a qualitative study. So this is just for to visualize this. This is not causation. It's just to show you that between local implementation and local political leadership, there is a tendency to the more let's say the higher they score on leadership, where I created a framework of how to score this, which we can find in the thesis, and local implementation. There is a correlation when it comes to local political leadership and administrative capacity as defined in this study. So in terms of conclusions, I don't have a lot of time, but as my presentation shows, mayors really have an essential role, especially their political commitment to the objective of attracting EU funds. It's very important, whether or not they are just doing this for electoral reasons or they really believe that this is an added value. They are agents of change, as we've seen in many Iranian cities, and despite of a national system that doesn't function well and practices that are maybe not in line with certain requirements, if there is political willingness, there is a capacity building, things can happen and EU funds can be channeled. So the biggest conclusion is that yes, administrative capacity is important, but without the political will, it's hard to build capacity and to maintain. So political leaders, on the other hand, can mobilize resources, can build administrative capacity. So that's why you need to have a higher hierarchy that oversees the process and takes stock of resources. In terms of this interaction between politicians and their administration, so their ambition, their interest, to align their ambitions, how many funds they want to acquire, how many investments they want to leave behind. This political ambition is very relevant to EU funds, and it needs to be put in relation with the measures that they take to prepare the administration for pursuing these political ambitions. How many funds, how many projects, and so on, and should be put in relation with administrative capacity, because a gap between these ambitions and the resources can have an impact on administrative capacity. Also, we find that strategic management and planning of resources is crucial when we want to build capacities. So administrative capacity building measures should be adapted to what type of capacity we want to build, but also to the institutional objectives. Recommendations that local authorities need to be more involved in the governance system, and for agency, for ownership, to keep them motivated. Also to involve local political leaders in broader EU policy design discussions when we design the policy for either, I don't know, to have two types of cohesion policies, or I don't know, to have their voice heard there. And also it's important to take stock of the political preferences of subnational governments in implementing EU funds, and what types of system can really involve political actors in policy implementations. Recommendations of capacity building measures. There is no recipe for how to build capacity. There is the conclusion is that it is important to align implementation goals with the measures we take, because if we have big goals, but we don't do much to prepare the administration, we might not reach our goals if we don't look at what type of resources we have. So thank you very much. Sorry about the length. I exceeded the time allocated, but I hope it was useful.
Thank you, Alina. Yes, very useful, very insightful, and really interesting findings on this, what you've labeled a performance puzzle, that despite much of the literature and commentators being quite critical actually of the Romanian case, that you do find variations at the local level and some good performing cities and towns, and also the factors that explain that performance in terms of capacity, leadership, in particular the interaction between capacity and leadership as well. I think we can open for questions now. Please do raise your hand and introduce yourself for the benefit of the others before you do ask a question. Is there anybody that would like to kick off? Hi, John.
Thanks, Carlos. Good to see
You're muted, John.
you.
No, it's fine now, actually. It's come back.
Okay. Thanks. Good to see you, Alina. Brought back memories of the last few years on your PhD. A lot of interesting issues we could potentially bring out, but I just wanted to focus on the last few slides where you were drawing out conclusions and recommendations from your research. This is a really timely discussion on the role of the local level and particularly local actors in terms of administrative capacity building. And there is a tension in the current debate, as there has been in previous debates, about how you make policy more place-based, how you get it closer to the citizen, how you involve the local level much more, and the top-down, the sort of prescriptiveness that we've seen with increasing conditions and conditionalities. And I wonder if you could reflect, if you were thinking about talking to people in the EU institutions or in the member states who are formulating ideas, contributing to the debate on the future of the policy, what your recommendations would be in terms of the balance between the top-down and bottom-up. You've shown that there's a lot of variation between towns and cities, and a lot of it depends on individuals and the structures within which they work. To what extent would you be recommending that there should be some form of prescription in terms of the new regulatory framework, or more work at the bottom in terms of capacity building support? And what kind of capacity building support would you be recommending?
Thank you very much, John, for your question, and nice to see you too. Yeah, this is not an easy question, actually, when what type of governance to create and how to involve local actors. I think that the biggest challenge for them was the lack of visibility towards the entire process, the policy process, actually, what are the EU goals, where is the cohesion policy going towards, and the tension between that and what they consider to be important to be financed, to be looked at. And so in terms of more involvement in discussions can make the EU policy process more aware of what is happening on the ground, because I have the feeling that both actors believe that the other one has a dead angle. At the local level, they have the feeling that no one knows what they are facing, and they have all these goals to reduce pollution levels, and when they have so basic needs, so they feel that they need speak more, to be heard, to be included. And at the EU level, they have the feeling that no one is doing anything and there is no interest on the at the local level. So maybe creating a space where formally they can contribute to designing either the program, maybe not the EU objectives because it's too broad. But I think a constant interaction can be good between different governance levels. I see that in Romania now they have the managing authority at the regional level, which was one of the recommendations in the thesis. So we see a closer relationship between managing authority now and local actors. So they closing this gap, relational gap, maybe between actors, can help to have policies more relevant, let's say, to local leaders.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Alina. We have a question from Fabian Gall.
Yes, hello. And likewise, very glad to see you again, Alina. It's good to see you, and such a fascinating research. It's really great. Just myself, so I'm employed by the managing authority of the Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes region in Lyon, but also doing a PhD on the implementation of cohesion policy. And as I just discovered, it's some of the it's very complementary. It's in some ways quite similar to what you're doing, we're doing, Alina. And for the case of Romania, I'm looking at beneficiaries and their actions in France in the Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes region. So I'd love to keep this discussion further. So you'll have an email from me probably in the next couple of days. So if you'd be willing to. I've just maybe three little questions that came up during your presentation. Very interesting to look at different outcomes on the local level. I was just wondering, how did you conceptualize, or how did you define the performance or the outcome on the local level? You talked about the spending rates in the beginning. How did you conceptualize this at a local level? And then I was also wondering what model was followed in Romania in terms of funding allocation. Did local authorities have to compete for funding, or were there certain amounts dedicated, fixed for the local administration or local authorities? And if I may, just a final question, sorry to bombard you with so many questions. I was wondering about this. You said about the local leadership that it's embedded in their context. Did you look specifically also at the relations between the local politicians and the managing authority, or at a national political level? Is that something that you've covered as well in your research? Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much. So just what was the first question?
The first one was on how did you conceptualize the
yes,
or
local
measure
implementation. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Outcome.
So thank you very much for your question, and I'm very happy to see there are synergies between my research and yours. It's very good to think about that. There is a follow-up. Local implementation, indeed, I did not include in the slides. But the way I had to adapt actually to the data that I had available. So at the time of the PhD, of the data collection, actually, Romania had a little contract signed with the local authorities. So I had to look, because actually what I wanted to do, what I wanted to find out is there an appetite at the local level for EU funds, and how can we conceptualize that? Because even if they have rejected projects, they will work on them, and maybe they will try to submit them. So I looked at how many projects they prepared and submitted, and I looked at the value of these projects. And I did not mention in the presentation, but the 8 municipalities they had, I looked at the non-competitive calls. So I said, okay, we have local authorities throughout Romania that receive this amount of money. We have a national concern that local authorities are not coming to spend this money which is given to them. So that's why with the puzzle, I mean, what do politicians do? What do politicians do with these EU funds? And so this is what I tried to look at, how many projects they prepared and submitted, what is the value, and also I looked at the pace. So it was very interesting for me to distinguish between local authorities that prepared early on, so they had a mature thinking processes and also operations, and those that started later on. So it was very important for me. So I also had to look at from the 3 years before. And also, this was another indicator to see what, to look at local performance, because it's not the same thing to react to something or to prepare 3 years in advance. And is also affected, or you asked me about this interaction between local level and managing authority, and it did happen specifically in the case of those local authorities that managed to prepare many projects, that managed to submit more projects than the allocation, and that started early enough. So actually they were earlier than the managing authority. They were asking questions the managing authority, what is happening about 2021, 2027 already, when 2014 was undergoing 2014, 2020, sorry. So this is how I conceptualize. I can send you the, in my thesis, I described in detail exactly how I measured it, and also the score I gave to each local authority based on the criteria, specific criteria. And so, yes, indeed, there was a relationship between local authorities, but this relationship was frequent. It was well developed in the case of those cities that managed to prepare many projects, and they were not even concerned about rejection, because they were thinking, this is what we want to do. We just have to channel through another source. And the second question was about first one, local implementation, third, relations between local level and managing authority, and the second was, sorry.
I think on the go you answered all three questions.
I covered it. Okay, so really sorry.
I'm
really sorry about that.
Answers. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Do we have more questions from the audience? Alexandru Brad.
Just say Alex.
Alex.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Alex Brad. I work at the Thun Institute in Braunschweig in Germany, and I've recently also completed a PhD where I compared cohesion policy in Germany and Romania, and was on the way a lot in northwest Romania. And I have a question regarding leadership at a regional level. Did you notice any mechanisms through which leadership at a regional level can promote leadership at a local level? And I'm talking here about soft learning mechanisms, which are probably at the edge of the formal processes, you know, the day-to-day learning, and learning as you're doing it, learning as you're implementing the cohesion policy. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yes, indeed. So my focus was on the local level, but I did have interviews at the regional level in the Northwest region and in the West region, because my cities were spread across these two regions. And indeed, there were leadership processes in both regions. And this helped me a lot, because in this way, I could rule out a little bit the regional level, and I could focus on the local level. So my first investigation, let's say, was the regional level, to compare how they go about implementing the EU funds, how they interact with the local actors, and how they promote. And the Northwest region has developed extensive mechanisms of engagement with the local actors. I mean, they are present there, they have ongoing discussions, they are very close. Actually, at that time, they were intermediate bodies. And this is something that I observed in the West region. So in terms of leadership in the West region, they would go to local authorities, they would have caravans, they would go there, speak with the mayor, with the team. So in terms of leadership, indeed, there was an active regional leadership. So I did not make, because it was not the focus of the thesis, but is another interesting research to do, to compare with other regions that have less leadership mechanism developed. But this helped me a lot with my thesis. So I could go below because I could find similar mechanisms. And in terms of communication, in terms of transparency, I could find that they function similarly. They function similarly. Of course, the perception of the local level is that they didn't do enough, or there is also a tension between what the region wants and what you can conceive that the region needs, and what you locally you think your city needs, because you have a very narrow view. But even yes, in terms of how they relate to the local level, indeed, strong leadership. I could say that I was impressed. I could say I was impressed in both regions by what the intermediate body was doing to engage locally. But unfortunately, there are still local authorities that have zero projects in EU funds. So despite that.
Okay, do we have a final question? So we have a minute or two left. Not, maybe I can ask Martin. You can come in.
Thanks. Just very, very quickly. Thanks, Alina, for the presentation. Nice to see you. I know this wasn't the thrust, or I realise it probably wasn't the thrust of your research, but going back to John's question and think about how cohesion policy can be adapted to pick up or to strengthen this sort of local level, community level involvement in cohesion policy. You mentioned the part of your framing of cohesion policy was looking at the specific territorial instruments that are funded in 2014 to 20. So things under sustainable urban development, the ERDF Article 7 and so on. I'm just wondering if, based on or thinking about other work that we're involved in, research that we're involved in, have these sort of instruments made a difference in terms of mobilizing local participation, identifying and involving local leaders, political leaders, administrative authorities at the local level and so on, because they are supposed to provide incentives. These instruments are supposed to provide incentives to do it. Pot of funding, the scope to do a territorial strategy, more say on project design and selection and implementation compared to mainstream cohesion policy. I just wonder, as I said, I realise this wasn't the main focus of your research, but do you think this sort of approach has made a difference compared to, as I said, mainstream cohesion policy, having these specific instruments? Have they played a role there?
Thank you very much, Martin, for your question. This specific instrument was very interesting to me because it complexified EU cohesion policy for local authorities. So that's why I was happy to see that in the case of Romania, they integrated this into the regional operational program. So it was, in a way, in a soft introduction to the topic. Local authorities, they said that it's business as usual. You have an ROP, as you had in 2007, 2013. But actually, they stumbled across this requirement, and they were really lost. So it has an impact in the sense that they, in a way, upgraded their strategic skills. They had to, if they were sleeping before, now they were awake. They were like, okay, so we cannot just do one project there, a road there that we could not fit into our local budget. Now we have to think outside the box for them. So this, I saw they were really disturbed by this, but maybe in a positive way, because they had no choice. They said, we received this funding, we have the regional pressure to, what are you doing with the funds? So they were critical that the regions, they are coming and knocking at their door. So they were pushed. In fact, this is what they had. They were forced to think about local investment in a different way. And I think this had a spillover effect. I mean, I saw, for instance, in Oradea, at the local level, I saw that they started to conceive local development from other sources of investment in a similar way. Rather than think, what is the funding there and how can I get it? The thinking was, what do I want to do and how do I integrate these investments into what is available out there as funding? So this forces you actually to think about synergies between investments. So, for instance, you would not do a road there and one at the opposite end. You would do that close by, and then they will serve something. You don't solve all the local problems, but at least you have a focus, a more local focus. So this is what I saw. One impact was that when I asked them, but how did you build these strategies and how did you conceive? And they were like, oh my God, it was difficult. Mm-hmm. This is what they said. And they were, so it did have, they pushed them a lot to, let's say, to be more complex, to be more sophisticated, to look at other countries. I saw examples of, for instance, investments in Japan, and they said, look, we saw this in Japan, and we're like, okay, this is what we can do for EU funds. So they were trying to learn from other countries, even outside the EU, in terms of urban development, but to integrate it there. So I think it pushed them to think about local development and urban development in a different way, and maybe proactively, because they realize, oh, we cannot just wait for the program to come to us. We have years before, we have to know what we want to do. And when the program gets there, we are prepared. So yeah, this is what I observed, at least in the Romanian case.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Alina, for spending the time to address all the questions. We've gone slightly over time, which is a reflection of how interesting and insightful the topic is. Thanks again, Alina, for presenting, and also to everybody else for participating and engaging and asking questions. Our next webinar will be on the 5th of June with Dr. Jessica Pulic from the Institute for Development and International Relations on the evolution of regional development agencies as strategic coordinators, the case of Croatia, which I note from your chart was also one of the lowest absorbing cases in the EU. To stay informed about upcoming events, please contact us and register for our mailing list if you haven't already. And we look forward to welcoming you to future webinars. Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alina.